Hello, and welcome to another episode of the High Danger Hockey Podcast. My name is Emma Miller, and this episode is all about you guys, the listeners. I asked on TikTok for some of the craziest NHL hot takes, and today I'm going to be responding to some of my favorites among the people who commented. So stay tuned for some very controversial NHL opinions and my thoughts on Connor McDavid, Luke Hughes, Connor Bedard, and the Blackhawks, and so much more. So without further ado, let's get into it. Today is going to be a viewer's choice type episode because I recently hit 500 followers on TikTok. So if you are among those 500 plus people, thank you so much for supporting High Danger Hockey. And I put it out there to the NHL on TikTok community, asking for some really wild, controversial opinions about the NHL. And boy, oh boy, did I get some very interesting responses. I got over 100 comments on that video, and today I've chosen a couple of my favorites to go ahead, analyze, respond to. One of the most popular topics in the comments was Connor McDavid. His name came up quite a bit in the comments, so I've selected 3 McDavid related comments, and I'm just going to talk about them a little bit and respond to them. So first things first, You Wish You Had Me Smith commented, McDavid is too overhyped. He's good, but damn, calling him McJesus with no cup is an exaggeration. Another similar comment was from DJ, who said, McDavid won't win a cup. And I asked, with the Oilers or at all? And he says, probably not at all. He's older now and performs well, but he can barely perform in the playoffs, let alone if he does get traded. It's unfortunate, but I don't see McDavid lifting the cup in his career. And finally, T said, McDavid isn't the greatest of all time. So there was a lot of sentiment in the comments that McDavid is overhyped, he's not as good as everyone says he is, and I am here, among many, to pump the tires of Connor McDavid. And I feel like I am not in the minority when I say I strongly believe Connor McDavid is the best player in the NHL today, and I think saying that he doesn't show up in the playoffs is simply factually incorrect. Each of the last 2 seasons, he led the entire league in scoring in the playoffs, and he's had 75 total points in just 47 games in those 2 Stanley Cup final losses to the Florida Panthers this year and last. And this next statistic might shock some people, but I certainly wasn't that surprised to learn. McDavid actually leads the league in playoff points dating all the way back to 2016. He has 150 points during that time in just 96 playoff games. The next closest player to him is Nikita Kucherov, who has 2 fewer points. He has 148 points, but the difference here is that Kucherov has played in 28 more playoff games, and of course, he has 2 Stanley Cup champs under his belt during that time. So the reason that I bring that up dating back to 2016 is just to prove Connor McDavid is not the problem. He is not the reason that the Edmonton Oilers have not had playoff success. And by playoff success, of course, the only metric that really matters is Stanley Cup victories, which they have not accomplished during that 9-year span. But as much as I believe that he's the best player in the NHL currently, that doesn't mean that the Oilers don't need to have a team around him to support him. And that's not to say the Oilers are not a well-constructed team, because they are. When you look back at the last 7 years, the Oilers are the league power play leaders during that time. And there are so many other metrics that you can bring up into this discussion that will illustrate just how good Edmonton is as a team. However, it hasn't been enough to support McDavid and to lift the team to that success. And a big problem that we saw this year, at least, was the goaltending. It was too inconsistent between Calvin Pickard and Stuart Skinner. The 2 of them just couldn't hang in there, especially against a Florida Panthers squad that jumped on every loose puck, capitalized on every mistake that Edmonton made. And there were certainly points in the Stanley Cup final where the Oilers looked better than the Panthers did. However, Florida is such an opportunistic team, and they are easily, in my opinion, the best constructed team in the league. So it would have taken near perfection from the Oilers to beat them, and that's not what they showed up with on the ice. However, that's no fault of Connor McDavid or Leon Draisaitl for that matter. So my question, I guess, rhetorically is a Stanley Cup ring the only way to measure a player's success? I think the answer to that is no, because you have guys like Marcel Dionne, Hall of Famer. He won the Art Ross. He won the Ted Lindsay Award twice, which was the Lester Pearson Award back then. This guy is highly decorated. He played over 1,300 NHL games and recorded over 1,700 points, yet he never even reached a Stanley Cup final as a member of the Los Angeles Kings, let alone lifting the cup. He is really by far the strongest player who never got a championship under his belt. So are we looking at Marcel Dionne and saying he's not one of the greatest players of all time? I think a lot of people would say yes, there are far better players out there. When you look at some of these other legends that are in the Hall of Fame alongside him, you have Wayne Gretzky, who won multiple Stanley Cups. You have Lemieux, who was a champion. But I don't think it's fair to diminish the accomplishments of players that did not reach that championship level, such as Marcel Dionne, or even someone like Paul Kariya or Pavel Bure. These guys were all legends in their own right, despite never reaching that goal and getting that Stanley Cup ring. And if McDavid doesn't get a championship by the time he retires in, 12 years from now, then he'll go down as the greatest player who never won a Stanley Cup. And that's an unfortunate recognition to have, right? But I think it's far too early to be making sweeping statements about McDavid not being as good as people think he is. And I don't think that winning a championship is the only thing that makes a player great, because that's a reflection of the team. That's not a reflection of an individual. If it was up to just one person to win a championship, then McDavid would be a perennial winner year after year after year. I think he deserves every bit of hype that he has. I think he is one of the most dynamic players that I have ever had the privilege of watching. I think he is this generation's top talent, and I think he will be for years to come. And I really see the Edmonton Oilers capitalizing on their Stanley Cup window this year, and if they don't, who knows what happens to McDavid in the future. I talked about this on a previous podcast, whether or not he would stay in Edmonton, and I do foresee him staying in Oiler, at least in the short term, but down the line, he is going to be chasing that championship if he doesn't accomplish that with the Oilers. Regardless, I think there's very little argument to be made against him as the league's top player right now. So no, he hasn't won a championship, but I mean, Devontae Smith-Pelly is a Stanley Cup champion. Is that really what we use to argue whether a player is good or not? There are so many highly talented players in the NHL today who have yet to reach that milestone. Joe Thornton never won a Stanley Cup. Patrick Marleau never won a Stanley Cup. Are those guys just not good players? Of course they are. So I think this whole conversation is a little bit overdone as far as McDavid is overhyped. He's not that good because he hasn't won a Stanley Cup. I think that's a little absurd, and I strongly believe McDavid is the best player in the league. So sorry to burst your bubble, guys. Sorry if I'm just, beating a dead horse at this point, talking about how good I think he is, but it's the truth, and it's my opinion, and that's what you're here for, right? Moving swiftly along, we have a comment from Sarah, who says that the Devils literally can't afford Luke Hughes. And if you're not up to date on the Luke Hughes situation, we are still waiting to see whether or not he is going to sign a contract extension with the New Jersey Devils. He's still a restricted free agent. General Manager Tom Fitzgerald said on July 1st that signing Luke Hughes was his top priority, and that has still not happened to this point, and it's August 24th at the time of this recording. So a lot of people are getting antsy waiting for some Luke Hughes news. And as far as whether or not the Devils can afford him, I don't know about all of that. I think the biggest issue on the table is the term of the contract right now. I think each side has something in mind that they like, and I don't think it matches up. And I really think that's the biggest holdup here. Luke Hughes is a very talented young defenseman, and if he were to sign a long-term contract, he would get some big money. He would be getting in the range of, $8 million annually. And that's probably what he's after here. But on the New Jersey Devils side of things, I would expect them to be more interested in a bridge deal, say 3 years in length, where they can sign him at a more reasonable rate, closer to about $6 million if I had to guess. And that would be perfect because New Jersey does have just over $6 million in cap space at the moment, so that would be just enough if they were to sign Luke Hughes at that rate on a shorter term deal. However, there is one really big concern when it comes to the contract length for Luke Hughes. It would be bad news for him to sign a 5-year deal because that would line him up perfectly with his brother Jack's contract. And if both Jack and Luke expire at the same time 5 years from now, that opens the door for them to walk away to another team together. And it has been established at this point that the Hughes brothers want to play on the same team. All 3 of them, in fact. The general manager of the Vancouver Canucks has come out and said that Quinn would probably be interested in joining his brothers after his contract ends. So there's a lot of buzz that come next July 1st, the Devils might be trying to pull some strings to get Quinn, to get all 3 brothers on the team. So it would not be wise on a team side of things to get Luke signed for 5 years because you don't want to see both of those deals expiring at once for Jack and Luke. And if they sign Luke at 5 years, that really decreases the chances of getting Quinn Hughes as well, because Quinn is really in the market for a long-term deal, a maximum term deal, and he's not going to want to do that if there's the possibility that his brothers will depart at the same time in 5 years. So those are some of the question marks surrounding the future of Luke Hughes right now. And I don't think there's need to panic at this time. I do think that come training camp as we approach September, I do think a deal will get done at some point. And don't forget, there are still players on the New Jersey Devils roster that are up for grabs for all intents and purposes, and one of them is Dougie Hamilton, and he carries with him a $9 million cap hit annually. So it might be difficult to find a suitor for someone like Hamilton as an aging defenseman and someone who makes an obscene amount of money. However, he is still a very viable top 2 defender, and I do think there are teams in the NHL who could use his talents. And if the Devils are able to get rid of that contract, that would free up so much space for Luke Hughes. For what it's worth, the Devils' defensive core is not going to suffer by losing Dougie Hamilton. They have a very strong lineup on the blue line with Jonathan Kovacevic leading the way, Brendan Dillon adding some grit and toughness and kind of more of a stay-at-home attitude. They have Shimon Nemec, a very offensive-minded defenseman who's growing into his role and will probably step into more of a top 4 role if Hamilton does depart. They have Seamus Casey rising through the ranks as a young prospect. And of course Luke, who is ready for more responsibility. So as much as emotionally a lot of people don't want to see Dougie go for his off-ice personality and for really his playmaking is still incredibly strong, the more business side of things, it would make sense to part ways with him at this point. And as I said earlier, that would give so much more financial flexibility to re-sign Luke now and to free up more space next summer in the case that the Devils try to acquire Quinn Hughes and then sign him to a big long-term extension. However, is it reasonable to expect Dougie Hamilton to be dealt before the season begins? No. So while that's all peachy keen to think about, that doesn't feel like the most realistic scenario here, that Dougie gets traded in the next month and Luke Hughes is magically re-signed. And that brings us back to square one, which is Sarah's opinion that the Devils can't afford Luke Hughes. And if we're talking a long-term deal right now, if Luke is interested in being signed to an 8-year contract extension, no, New Jersey probably cannot afford that, especially not without freeing up more space and making more moves. However, if both sides are willing to compromise, which is questionable at this point since it hasn't happened yet and we're almost 2 months into the negotiating window, right? That's obviously not very optimistic, but at the same time, I do see Luke Hughes remaining a New Jersey Devil, It's just a matter of when he signs and what the term is. So I will certainly be keeping an eye on that situation as it continues to develop. And speaking of contract extensions, one player who's eligible to re-sign but still hasn't yet is Connor Bedard. And T Miller 819 says, the Blackhawks are going to mess around and not build a team quick enough, and they are going to lose Connor Bedard. And I really hope that is not the case for the Chicago Blackhawks franchise. And I don't think there's major cause for concern as far as him re-signing just yet. I think the closer we get to July 1st of next year without a contract, each day that passes, there will be a little bit of growing concern, right? However, I don't think now is the time to be really worried and hitting the panic button just yet. And I'm going to refer to one of the NHL's most trusted insiders, Frank Saravalli, and what he had to say on the BR Open Ice podcast recently regarding Connor Bedard. And that is, Bedard and the Blackhawks are probably waiting to see how year 3 goes before jumping the gun and signing a massive contract that might not turn out well. So at this point, it's not necessarily a matter of whether or not Bedard will re-sign. It's a matter of what the terms on that deal is going to be. And Saravalli on this podcast had said he originally expected a deal to be in the range of $9 to $10 million annually for Connor Bedard, probably a maximum length deal, so an 8-year contract. But there are two things that might affect the Connor Bedard extension, and the first of those is Frank Nazar's recent re-signing, which he signed at $6.6 million annually, and that's a little higher than some people expected. I know that's a little more than I was expecting to see, given the fact that he only played, 56 games this year, and granted, he really stood out. He really had a breakout performance, but he hasn't even played a full NHL season yet, so they're really putting a lot of stock in this young guy. And it's definitely going to be curious whether or not that $6.6 million figure affects what Bedard signs at, because Saravalli thinks it might tip the scale in a little bit of a lower direction in terms of Bedard's contract. He might get closer to $8 million in that case. But it's guys like Frank Nazar that are going to entice Connor Bedard to stay in Chicago. And that's kind of twofold, because the responsibility falls partially on the players to perform to a higher level, even given the fact that they don't have the strongest roster to work with. And that brings us to the other part, which is management needs to do more to convince Connor Bedard that there is going to be a window for success in the near future. And I think they've begun to accomplish that by re-signing Nazar long term. And I also think they're attempting to reinforce the roster through the draft, which they did successfully by selecting Anton Frondell 3rd overall in this 2025 entry draft. And Frondell is a tremendously talented player waiting in the pipeline who can very much be a potential line mate for Connor Bedard. He is going to spend another year in Sweden developing, and when he's ready for NHL action, that spot next to the Bedard is going to be looking really good. And by locking up Nazar long term, by drafting someone like Frondell, the last piece there is making some kind of big move in order to get more of a star power lineup that can be shaped around Bedard, because right now there's not enough of that. There's the half of the roster that's aging and kind of a little bit past their prime, and there's the younger half of the roster that hasn't even proved that they're NHL ready necessarily. So the Blackhawks are going through some growing pains, and much of that responsibility is going to fall on management, although they also want to see the current players perform up to the potential that is there, because there are a lot of young, talented prospects in the pipeline for the Blackhawks. It's just not enough to have success right now. And the other thing that's going to be affecting Bedard's term and annual salary is just going to be how he performs in his 3rd year in the NHL. Because Bedard has really been a standout on a poorly performing Blackhawks team. However, he's not necessarily living up to the expectations of a 1st overall pick. But that's not to say that he's not still a highly skilled guy. He has 128 points in 150 career NHL games so far, and in his first full NHL season this past year, he had 23 goals and 67 points, again, on a team that did not produce a lot of offense. So he's doing the best he can with what he has, and that's unfortunately not very much right now. So I think the pressure is on and the clock is ticking for Blackhawks management to do something to convince Bedard to stay. And that doesn't mean that now is time to sound the alarm bells of, oh, Bedard's not going to resign, what are we going to do? I think everyone take a deep breath. There's still plenty of time to work out a contract extension. It just really depends on, one, the way Bedard performs this year, and two, what Kyle Davidson is going to do to show him, hey, we really do want to have a winning roster, and we think we can do it by bringing on these guys, by drafting this talent, by offering you these line mates to play with. That's what Bedard needs in order to be convinced to stay. So there's no reason to be pessimistic quite yet, and he probably will end up re-signing during the season at some point. That's obviously not off the table by any means. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about NHL Expansion, because Hockey in the Desert comments that they predict the league is going to expand to 36 teams by the year 2030, and Arizona will get an NHL team again. And to this, I have to say, yes and no. Krause Sports and Entertainment Group has already formally met with the NHL about bringing a team back to Atlanta, and they have it all set up. Forsyth County has approved the plan to build a state-of-the-art arena that they could play in. It's just north of Atlanta, so it's not in city limits, but it's right off the highway, and this place is going to be called The Gathering, and it's going to feature an arena, some practice rinks, apartments, shops, you name it, they're going to have it. It's going to be a large entertainment complex. The big holdup here is that it's not projected to be completed until at least 2033. So I don't agree with Hockey in the Desert about that 2030 deadline, but I do think that Atlanta is an extremely realistic option to get an NHL team in the next 10 years. And there's plenty of discourse about that. You know, Atlanta has already had 2 teams at various points during the NHL history. So they obviously had the Atlanta Flames back in the 70s, and they had the Thrashers in the early thousands. They moved in 2011, and both of those clubs unfortunately failed in the end, mostly due to low attendance and financial issues. So it's a big question mark whether or not a third go would be any more successful, especially given the fact that they'd be playing outside of the city proper. So while the Flames and Thrashers both played in downtown Atlanta right off of a subway stop, you would have to drive to the rink in order to see this potential new Atlanta team. Public transport might be an issue, although again, it is right off the highway, so very easily accessible by car. But that is one logistical concern, and of course, like I mentioned, the other one is fan support. But all those things considered, it is still probably the next destination for an NHL team. And the other most likely one that's being brought up is Houston. And there are 2 ownership groups that are really pushing to bring another NHL team to Texas. But the more viable option, according to ESPN reports, is going to be Dan Friedkin, who has met with the NHL and Gary Bettman multiple times at this point to discuss a team coming to Houston. And Friedkin and his sports entertainment group do already own a men's soccer team in Italy, and they have had significant financial success under the Friedkin group, and they also just got a brand new venue, and that bodes really well for them being a solid ownership group. However, the owner of the Houston Rockets is also very interested in pursuing that. Although again, like I said, ESPN does believe that Friedkin is going to be the more viable option here. So that's in much earlier stages than the Atlanta expansion is at this point. And again, nothing has been decided on this front. For the time being, 32 NHL teams is it. But Atlanta and Houston are the most commonly discussed locations for new franchises. But there are also some other cities in the mix here that could be surprising, because I know I was surprised when I was doing research for this video and I discovered these things. First off, the Louisiana governor had some conversations with Gary Bettman about bringing a team to New Orleans, which would be a fascinating destination for an NHL team, although geographically it makes sense. Located not too far from Texas, fairly close to Atlanta, hypothetically, but also fairly close to Florida, just a short plane ride away from, the Florida Panthers and the Tampa Bay Lightning. Geographically, New Orleans is in a decent spot. And if we're looking back at the All-Star game from 2024, Gary Bettman did discuss some other potential destinations for new franchises, and at that time, he gave a list that included Omaha, Nebraska, Kansas City, Cincinnati, Atlanta, Houston, and Salt Lake City. And as we know, Salt Lake did eventually get a new franchise in the Utah Mammoth, and that has gone extremely well in their first year of existence. And so we circle back to the fact that Arizona lost its NHL franchise to the Utah Mammoth, and there still is a possibility that Arizona gets another team. And Gary Bettman did not close the door on bringing the Coyotes back in the future, because really it was mismanagement by the owners that caused the whole financial problems with the Coyotes. If you remember, they weren't paying some of their hotel bills, allegedly. There was just a lot of financial missteps in that regard, and that was really the downfall of the Coyotes. There was no good arena for them to play in. They were playing in Mullet Arena for a couple of seasons, which only had a capacity of about 5,000 fans, and that's just not reasonable long term. They couldn't get an arena done in time. So there were plenty of factors why Arizona had to be relocated, but I do agree with Hockey in the Desert that the Coyotes could be back in the near future. And I do think we're looking at the next 10 years. And I do think that if the NHL does continue to expand, they're going to be adding 2 teams at once. That would make things so much easier logistically. Add 1 team in each conference. You could add Atlanta in the East, Houston in the West, and that would really significantly reduce any problems with realignment or having to change the divisions, which is still going to have to happen, of course. So, will the NHL expand to 36 teams? Someday, yes. Will hockey return to the desert and Arizona? Yes, someday. Will it happen by the year 2030? No. Unfortunately, because I live in Arizona and I really miss going to Coyotes game. One of the highlights of my year every year was the annual road trip up to Phoenix to see the Coyotes play the New Jersey Devils in particular. It was always so much fun, and really the fan atmosphere was great at Mullet Arena, but I understand that that wasn't sustainable. So there are just some ducks that have to be put in a row before hockey can return to Arizona, but I do think it does happen at some point, and I really look forward to that day because I miss it. So we heard some pretty controversial hot takes in this episode, but I want to know your thoughts. What do you think about Connor McDavid? Does Luke Hughes re-sign with the New Jersey Devils before the season starts? Will Connor Bedard be a Blackhawk beyond this season? And where does the NHL go next in terms of expansion? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm super eager to hear what you guys think, and I'd love to do another episode like this in the future, so feel free to follow us on social media. You can find us at High Danger Hockey on TikTok, at High Danger Pod on X. We're also on Instagram, and of course you can listen to this podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I really appreciate your time. I've thoroughly enjoyed interacting with y'all in this episode, so take care, and I will see you next time.